Tu podcast w głowie się mieści. Okay, so hello Jeff, and thank you again for being a guest of my podcast. My guest is Jeff Conway. He is the current president of the International Society of Schema Therapy. He is also a founding member of the ISST. And you served in the several roles in general in the ISST since its foundation.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Adam. I'm happy to chat with you. And I have been very involved with the ISST to the present. I really believe in the power of the schema therapy model and the kindness and compassion and humanity that I think is part and parcel of it. And also the effectiveness of the model in a limited reparenting therapist's hands. And so I'm happy to be part of the society that helps promote the training and treatment and research on this model.
Yeah. And also you are a supervisor of the schema therapy, and you was also the coordinator of the training of the schema therapy. Yeah.
Exactly. That was my last role on the executive board, is the training coordinator, which is basically trying to improve the quality of training and the quality of training programs throughout the world and help all those programs to flourish.
Yes, I finished also one of them here in Poland. So it's like you said, is a great cognitive behavioral method. Not only like the cognitive behavioral, because it includes like also like many other theories.
If I may comment on that, it is an outgrowth of the cognitive behavioral therapy model. Jeff Young, who created schema therapy, was very much a part of the Beck Institute back in the 80s. And if I may just share a little bit about his process towards developing schema therapy, is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
He actually saw the beauty and the effectiveness of CBT. And he saw that with certain people he was working with, either it didn't seem to be particularly effective at all, or the effectiveness sort of wore out over a period of time. And so Jeff thought, if there's a way to do more emotional work with someone while also holding on to what is so valuable about cognitive behavioral therapy, you might be able to help people who haven't been particularly well helped with CBT. And so object relations theory, attachment theory, Gestalt thinking, all very much influenced his creating this integrated model of schema therapy, and without losing the valuable cognitive behavioral therapy aspect for it. But there's a greater emphasis on the therapeutic relationship, in particular limited reparenting, and also the emotional experience of one's, patterns, or as we always call them, schemas. So.
Yeah, exactly. And like here in the schema therapy, like the very important role is the therapeutic relationship. And the limited reparenting, like one of the I think biggest the change methods.
Absolutely. I think we think of that as the core of schema therapy. One of the aspects that makes schema therapy quite unique is the stance or the role of the therapist as a limited reparenting agent. What we think about when we talk about limited reparenting is, how do I, if I'm the schema therapist, address, inform, educate, and meet the needs of the person I'm working with that were not adequately met in their early life throughout their developmental years and help the person I'm working with figure out ways in their relationships presently and relationships with the future to have those needs met in his or her life outside of the therapeutic relationship. But in order to do that, it really requires the therapist, the schema therapist, to assume this limited reparenting, role and help our patients identify the needs, identify which needs were not adequately met, which then develop the schemas in the first place. And in the limited boundaries of the therapeutic relationship, meet some of those needs while educating a patient to help make sure those needs are met outside of the therapeutic relationship. But it's really it's like the most active ingredient of schema therapy, I think.
Yeah. And I know that you also specialized in treatment of the one of the 18th of the core maladaptive schemas called the enmeshment and undeveloped self schema.
Yes.
And my first question about the schema when did you become interested in the particular one schema, the enmeshment schema?
Yeah, I felt like I kind of stumbled into understanding the importance of the enmeshment and undeveloped self schema. And it's kind of was like accidental trial and error, where I was working with certain people and thinking that there was another schema involved, oftentimes the defectiveness shame schema. And doing work on it didn't seem to make much difference in how they viewed themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I started to think of other possibilities, other reasons why they're feeling so insecure within themselves, why they feel of less value, of why they might be going into what we call an imposter syndrome. There may be a Polish way of saying it that's different than here, where that's a common phrase. I feel like I'm an imposter and I'm going to be found out. That was a common experience of a lot of the people I was working with, where I wasn't making a whole lot of traction with them. But then when I really started looking more closely at enmeshment, undeveloped self, I had a sense that this feeling they had wasn't so much driven by shame, but of a kind of anxiety and a confusion about who they were and how they should live. And so that made me think more about the enmeshment, undeveloped self. And then upon further exploration, I saw that it was a very, very common experience with a lot of these patients' early life, where there was, an important figure, often a parent, who inadvertently, kind of took advantage of them, co-opted their personality, co-opted their particular caring traits, their talents for the parents' own gratification, their own care. And so a child kind of put in that position, finds, without them knowing it, that their own ability to value their own self-reflection and practice their own autonomy and to develop their own autonomy is underdeveloped because their focus is on a caregiver. Another area that really highlighted this schema is from a group of people that I worked with, and those are male survivors of childhood sexual abuse.
Yes, I remember.
I've led a group and still lead a group of male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And one of the things I learned from them, outside of the obvious schemas that could come from that kind of early life abuse, mistrust abuse, defectiveness, emotional deprivation, is again a kind of confusion about who they are and their autonomy rights as a human, because they've been so impinged upon, from others in their life throughout these very impressionable impressionable early years.
Yeah.
And so it's like, so when I started thinking, it's not just these obvious schemas. It is these obvious schemas, but it's not just these obvious schemas: mistrust, defectiveness, deprivation. It's also the undeveloped self, the sense that I don't really know what's going on within me and what I have a right to do.
Like I don't have this insight. Like
exactly.
The ability.
To sort of reflect on myself and to value what I reflect about myself, and to allow what I reflect upon to inform the choices I make, in particular, the interpersonal choices, that I can be in relationship with someone and make choices that are right for me, even though they might not be right for the person I'm in some sort of relationship with.
Yeah. And I remember it from your interview for the ISST, that in this group of the male survivors of the sexual abuse, there was two participants that they hadn't got such kind of sexual abuse. They wasn't physically, but they had the same problems. Yeah, and you were worried that they be not being included into a group, but you find out that they have a very similar.
Yeah. It was a very interesting learning curve for me when I was meeting with a couple of these guys, talking about them perhaps joining this group, and even though there were qualities and experiences they had that seemed similar to other sexual abuse survivors, there was no actual physical contact with the caregivers who did take advantage of them. But there was clearly a high level of emotional exploitation where their attention was pulled towards a parent or another very significant caregiver. And kind of the emotional net effect was very much aligned with the male survivors who were physically sexually abused. So I wanted to take the risk, it seemed like a risk at the time, to introduce these members to the group, and wondering if they might say, wait a minute, this person wasn't physically sexually abused. It doesn't fit. And there was like no reaction whatsoever. The group members got it, that this was a kind of abuse that was very much akin to their own experience that was also physically sexual abuse. And many of the physical abuse survivors had the concurrent emotional abuse as well. So they totally got it. And these new members were very much embraced by this group, and I think benefited from the group just as much as anyone else. So that was the really big learning curve for me. And thinking in that way, that if you've been physically abused, there's usually an emotional kind of exploitation going on as well. And even if you're not literally sexually, physically abused, there is that emotional exploitation, which has the net effect of causing a sense of shame and a sense of mistrust, but also just a sense of, I don't have choices in relationship. I'm sort of at the whim of whoever it is I'm in relationship with. They call the shots. They call the relational shots.
The kind of disconnection, like insight with also the internal world after such experiences, sexual abuse. Yeah,
exactly. And I think disconnection's a really good word out of it, because people who are enmeshed, they literally feel as though they're like overly connected, meaning that they kind of overlap with the other person, or like literally physically connected to them. But and that can be the actual feeling and the experience of it, but they're actually not connected to that person, because there's not a sense of I'm understanding this person, nor is this person understanding me. I'm just sort of bound by this sense of obligation And the obligation drives the relationship, not a reciprocal understanding and care for each other. So it's a different kind of disconnection I see, even though it might look very close.
But
it's really not close in the sense of being seen and understood, which is something that enmeshment, undeveloped self people really have suffered from, not feeling well understood and really well seen by anyone, nor do they think it's even possible.
So how you can tell that someone has developed the enmeshment and undeveloped self schema?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not always easy because, as you know, we have this ISST form where different experiences are described and you rate it on a Likert scale from 1 to 6, whether it describes you perfectly or not. And there are about 10 questions that relate directly to enmeshment on undeveloped self. Overly concerned by other things. I feel like I have to always be present for my parents. Those kinds of statements. And a lot of times people don't rate them highly, who in exploration of their early life and of their current life and relationships and how I experience in the room seem to have the enmeshment and undeveloped self schema. And there are a number of theories why someone wouldn't score highly on it and indicate that this is a likely schema. One is that they're in a mode, like when they're filling out the form, like a detached avoidant mode or a surrender mode, in a kind of protective mode of their parents, like they don't want to reveal something that could be shaming of their parents. It's a kind of like an excessive caretaking of them that they couldn't tolerate it. So they might, rate that very low.
Or some defensive mode that they rate everything on 1, for example.
Exactly. And that happens fairly regularly with a lot of people we give the forms to. It's not just limited to the enmeshment undeveloped self, could be all 1s. Sometimes they're literally all 1s. Or maybe the ones that would get higher scores are ones that some of our patients can spin as that this is actually a strength. Like I've had people who 1s, and then the unrelenting standards, which is a kind of perfectionism, that some people can rate as sort of like a positive quality, that I just really do things well. All of a sudden you have these super high scores, but they're seeing it as a strength as opposed to
something positive.
That it actually, in some ways, we have to look closely at that, and they can see with exploration that it actually has been an impediment. So the form often isn't helpful in identifying it. What usually is helpful is an exploration of what's going on currently in their life, what brought them to therapy in the first place. Like I feel like I have to always take care of my husband and my wife, and I don't feel like I have a choice to be any other way than that, a kind of extreme caregiver. That might be a presenting problem. I feel stuck or I feel trapped. Those are common words that when you really drill down a little bit, it speaks to an undermined autonomy. Like I don't have a sense that I have choices. I'm like backed into a corner, and somehow someone has to get me out of this corner that I'm trapped in, that I'm stuck in, because I don't feel like I have it within me. And another common characteristic that could reveal that enmeshment undeveloped self is probably a high schema for this person is when you ask them about their own experience, they'll often start talking about, well, others. My mother feels this way, and that's why this is that way, or my husband, my wife feels that way. And to sort of like be redirected back to, but what's your own internal experience? There's a I feel like a not fully conscious deflection of that. Let's not look at me, let's look at the other.
Like in the couples therapy, when someone asks a couple what's your problem? So they answer like, we used to, like, that there is no separation between those two people.
And couples, it can be very revealing, where one becomes a spokesperson and say, we just are so angry at each other all the time. Like that's almost literally what some people have said in a couple session. And then I'd ask the partner and they would be like, I don't feel that way. I mean, that's not my experience. I have a very different experience of why we are having these troubles. But there's this, or they both would agree, but then when you really drill down, it's specifically what their issues are in the relationship. They actually have very different experiences, but they kind of impose on the other what they think both of their issues are, instead of seeing each other as two individual people, struggling to understand each other and to build a life together,
Yeah. And are they maybe also any particular behaviors that show up during session that could be specific for maybe enmeshment and undeveloped self schema?
Yeah, well, it's so important to, like with any schema, to think in terms of not just the schema, but the overriding behavioral mode.
Yeah.
So often people can go into a very strong surrender mode. And if that's the case, if it's the enmeshment, undeveloped self, and a very prominent default mode of surrender, compliant surrender, there might be a strong pull, or I might have a sense that they really want to take care of me and give me what they think I need, and also help me feel good as a therapist, that I'm doing a good job,
Yeah. So they could be like the perfect patients, so that they agree with everything from these behaviors, that we want to.
Like they help them make the changes that they want to make, that, we're helping them make the changes. It's all kind of coming together, and any idea I give them or suggestion or insight is like, oh my gosh, that's so helpful. Those kind of perfect patients are often, for me, have become like alarm bells towards a likely enmeshment undeveloped self, that they kind of schema instinctually think I need bolstering up, that I need to feel like I'm okay as a therapist. And though they proceed to show me that I'm okay as a therapist, which of course, as a therapist, it can be kind of seductive, because it's like, I'm rocking this. Like, I really know how to do this therapy thing. But you hopefully we can get clear that there's something else going on, that it's not, that I'm maybe not such a perfect therapist, but they want me to feel like I'm a really good therapist because they think I need to feel that way. And that's like usually a wonderful opportunity, if I'm aware of it, to sort of say, gee, it seems like you want to take care of me, or you want to make sure I'm like a really good therapist. And that often can open up a conversation about a role they were often in, often in their family of origin, often with a parent, to build up, to buoy that parent to feel okay about him or herself. So that's a very, very common feature in the therapy room. And if a person goes into another mode, like an avoidant mode, it goes back to not really knowing what's going on within them. Like you just told me something kind of, it sounds like very painful about your current relationship or related to your family. What are you feeling inside? That then the avoidance is, I have no idea. They kind of have
like a fog. Yeah.
A fog. Yeah, very much. Fog is actually a really good word, because I think that's part of the undeveloped self. Part of it is their sense of their own experience is very confusing and vague and abstract. And so their ability to sort of reflect back on whatever the conversation is, how that impacts them on the inside is foggy. It seems kind of out of reach in the session, which is really common. And then, some people do go into like an overcompensating mode. Like,
it's very interesting how it could looks like that someone is hyper-compensation.
Yes. Yeah. I think I've said, or I know I've said, but I don't know if it was something if I mentioned in the presentation you're referring to, that people are kind of on the narcissistic spectrum, often have a fairly high enmeshment undeveloped self. And often a reason for that is they were exploited in a different way than someone who is like kind of emotionally taken advantage of. You need to listen to me. You need to, help me feel secure, like a parent would be that way. It's more of the parent's communication is, you need to be a shiny object for me. You need to be someone I could say, look at my son, look at my daughter, look at how brilliant they are, look at how beautiful they are, look at how talented they are, those kinds of things. And that's kind of who you are, is whatever that shininess of you it is. And then that can sort of come into the therapy room where these patients will often want to kind of wow me with that which makes them special and not really know what else to share about them, because everything else isn't really special. It's just about their humanity, which, from my vantage point, probably your vantage point, has its own specialness, but it doesn't make a person stand out. My identity is that which makes me stand out to someone with this form of enmeshment and with this form of overcompensating mode. And it indicates to me, or it certainly makes me think that there's the potential this is driven by a very confused sense of self and like an inability to sort of develop a more secure sense of who they are, what is important to them, and what they feel and think about beyond that which makes them shiny,
Yeah, that's like to shiny. So this is like the only thing that they maybe knew, that they had to shine to be in the relationship, and without being a star, so there's nothing, and maybe they don't know like the child that is left alone outside the building.
Exactly. If it's not the shine, then who am I? That's what I think can be very threatening to these people with this combination of enmeshment and overcompensating. Like, you take the overcompensating away, and it's almost like I disappear. I have no idea who I am. And God forbid, if I do find out who I am, I might just be ordinary. And that's not who a person like me should be. But I think it's a very painful, poignant process that ultimately, if someone with this combination of schema and mode can hang in the therapy process, can come to really value themselves and understand themselves in a more authentic way, as opposed to this sort of artificial way that this is who I am, the brilliant, successful person.
So I've seen the Elvis movie. I don't know.
Oh, I have too. Yeah.
Is it something similar, or?
I think I think everyone who's interested in enmeshment undeveloped self should go see Elvis. Because I think he really was grappling with the enmeshment undeveloped self. Sort of for those, I don't think this is spoiler alert territory, but because so much has been written about the guy, but a disconnected father, a mother who didn't get the kind of attention from the father that she needed, and had a lot of emotional needs that she didn't know how to address in an adult way. And this sensitive child and teenager who was, feeling his mother's pain, and felt like, that his attention needed to be focused to a great degree on her and propping her up and keeping this relationship alive. And I think one of the net effects is a real confusion about who he is. And which, I think fame, just to go off to editorialize a bit, is a very toxic substance. But it's particularly so if you don't have an inner sense of security, if you don't have this kind of inner sense of who you are and what's really important to you. And so here he had this enmeshment schema, very young person, incredible fame, and a lot of confusion. And again, this is how this movie is very helpful. The colonel who kind of basically shepherded his career took great advantage of him and put him in harm's way because Elvis wanted to be led because he didn't feel like he could lead himself. He didn't have that internal compass.
Yeah, like his mother.
Exactly. Yeah. His compass was like what his mom did, and then
he replaced the colonel. Like he replaced his mother in this enmeshment.
Yeah, exactly. And just to sort of use the story a little further. Excuse me.
Okay.
I think he struggled with addictions, which I find a lot of people who I've worked with who struggle with addictions have a very high enmeshment on udeveloped self. And one of the ways I've understood it and framed it for some of these patients is the anxiety of not knowing what's going on, of feeling kind of rootless internally, is quelled by some sort of addictive process, whether it be drugs or alcohol or sex or, day trading or whatever. Those things sort of give you some temporary relief from this anxiety, this kind of existential anxiety of, who am I and what am I doing? Exactly. And pain. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's a very helpful movie.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty good one too.
Yeah, very good. And we start to say to our patient with the enmeshment schema, just to watch the movie, like to connect with maybe some similar experiences from their life. Yeah, like a movie therapy. So I think it's a great movie also to use it in the therapy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's been a handful of movies over the years that I thought were really great at identifying. I've had people, go see this movie, or now because it's so easy to access movies and from past and present, to sort of just turn on your computer.
Netflix or something.
Yes, exactly.
Like this. Yeah.
Exactly.
And we start to talk about the family of Elvis. So what would be a key, the key characteristics of the family that's led to develop the enmeshment and undeveloped self schema? I know that we already said pretty a lot about it, but assuming what is the most important.
Yeah. Well, I think two of the needs that really help cultivate a sense of self are a developed sense of autonomy because we have that innate need to be autonomous. It's as innate as our need to be attached to other people. It's very much part of our core wiring.
Yeah.
But it needs to be developed, and a sense of autonomy is developed in relationship. And in our early years, it's usually developed in relationship with our parents or whoever our caregivers are. And so a lot of parents who end up not helping to develop an infant child's, teenager's autonomy aren't intentionally trying to do that. They're just not aware of how important it is. And they're over-aware of what they need from the child. Like the parent doesn't seem to have a sense that there needs to be a boundary between the parent, the child, in terms of, what the parent worries about, what they struggle with, what their priorities are to a certain degree, that those are more within the context of adult relationships. But because there isn't an adult around, or the adult that is around isn't available, and also because perhaps the person, even though they're, let's say, a 30, 40-year-old adult, they're in kind of a child mode much of the time. They're not able to make that distinction between them as a 30-year-old adult and their child, who is in a very different developmental place and needs very different developmental kinds of attention. They're not cognizant of that. And so in a child mode, they impose their needs and their vulnerabilities and their aspirations on the child. Again, not knowing what the net effect of this is going to be, at least not fully conscious of it. I think some parents are semi-conscious of it, but they just need that so much, or they so prioritize what the parent needs, that the child gets relationally pulled in that direction because the child wants a relationship with the parents and needs the relationship with the parent, including the protection of the parent. Yes. So the child would kind of mold themselves with whatever attributes they have that seem to keep the parents' attention on them. But it's sort of because I'm focusing my attention on you, if you're the parent, I'm not looking within myself and exploring what I want, what I need, what I think, those kinds of things. Those kind of take the back seat. Those are of secondary status to what I think is going on with you and what you want from me. So having a parent that's too often in a child mode, and therefore kind of breaking the boundaries of them as a parent with their own actual child, has a net effect of, first of all, not seeing the child as a child, attunement, a lack of attunement, and an unwitting undermining of their autonomy. Now, there's another kind of parent that's pretty common, and that is one that goes into kind of an overbearing, demanding, critical mode, where the child becomes like almost under a microscope that's scrutinized in terms of what they should be based on sort of the parent's template of what a child of theirs must be like. And their attention is about molding the child from the inside out, or from the outside in, as opposed to helping the child discover from the inside out who they are, because this sort of way of being gets imposed on them in this overbearing kind of way, and sometimes the parent thinks or knows they're doing the right thing for the child, but not, but they think they are. Yeah. And sometimes they're not even thinking about that. They just think the child should be this way.
You must be like me, or
Exactly. Or the kind of person that I can say, that's my son, that's my daughter.
It's my proud. Yeah.
I am worthy of admiration because of the way he or she turned out. And so children sort of become that way because, again, they want that parent's attention. They want that sense that the parent is committed to them. And so they'll kind of contort themselves to be a certain way and sort of unconsciously saying no to autonomy, because that's getting in the way of having this relationship, which I need so desperately. So it works because they have some connection. Oftentimes it's a fraught connection. It's one that's, feels painful, but it's still a connection. Without knowing that the net effect is, not feeling like you can be very autonomous or really understand yourself very well.
Okay, so like there is no boundaries between me and my parent, and to not having not having my own self or choices, like that. This is the way of being in the relationship, that I cannot do things that I want to. On the one hand, I don't know what I want to, but I feel so so intense that I cannot like to separate from my parents to do my own life. Like,
yeah, you're putting conscious words to what's usually not a conscious experience. And I think what you said about want is really important, because a lot of times it's like they don't even know what they want, because they know they need that parent's attention. And so whatever else is going on within them gets just pushed to the margins for the sake of getting that thing. And so the sense of wanting and having clarity about that is very muted, very abstract. And that's actually part of kind of the discovery process in therapy. Is like, let's see if we can get a sense of what you actually want instead of what you think you need to be for whoever it is that's across from you.
Yeah. And about the therapy, the basis on your experience, what are the most significant traps and challenges working with the patient with the enmeshment and undeveloped self schema?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few, but one that I think is really important, and I say this a lot because I believe it to be true, is a lot of we therapists, schema therapists included, have an enmeshment undeveloped self schema. And that may be part of the reason why we're therapists in the first place. So we maybe go into a type of people pleasing with our enmeshment patients who are also doing that with us, and being overly attentive to them without being attentive to our own experience and giving words to that. And I want to tease that out a little bit more, because I don't like to think, for myself or for therapists in general, that we found ourselves in this field because of schemas. The schemas have kind of put us into this kind of caretaking role.
Like in general, the psychologist is the person who is searching help for themselves first.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm trying to heal myself. In the meantime,
like the only reason.
I got a profession out of the deal, but I did help myself. Sometimes I'm still trying. But what I think is more accurate is an enmeshment undeveloped self schema can be a variable that can pull someone towards this profession. But I think what's more of a drawing force is that a person has empathy, has a high level of empathy, high level of compassion, a high level integral desire to be caregiving. And those are really authentic qualities of a lot of therapists, certainly a lot of schema therapists, because it's sort of self-selective. Those are things that we put a really high value on. And those are real. And I think children who temperamentally have greater strengths in those areas, compassion, empathy, insight, EQ, emotional IQ, and put them in a family where there's the dynamics that I described, then that schema can develop. But it doesn't mean that the actual natural attributes of empathy, compassion, etc., aren't real and don't give the person pleasure to express them in their life and in their profession. So, it's complicated. I do think for a lot of us, we want to be empathic, caring people, and the schema is part of it too.
Yeah. So we need to pay attention to our own schemas and mode during the session. To not try to on 100% please the patient, because it doesn't help him. We need to also sometimes set the boundaries, or do things that for us, having this schema could be unpleasant.
Yeah, and this is one of the pitfalls of the enmeshment schema is there's a kind of a pull towards, enmeshing, and someone with the enmeshment schema wants to sort of be in alignment with the therapist, but that just perpetuates the schema. So this is where it's really important to empathically be your own person, you as the schema therapist, and have your own reactions, and to share those reactions, even, or I'd say especially, if your reactions are not in sync with the other person. Because there's the idea that being two people in relationship who have various differences is kind of alarming, but healing for a person with the enmeshment undeveloped self. That it's not about us being blended. It's not about us being joined at the hip. It's about us taking in who we are, the ways in which we're similar and the ways we are different, and that we can have closeness while dealing with the tension and appreciating the differences, because I think differences cause tension and differences can be enjoyed too. Not so much with someone with the high enmeshment, like the differences can feel threatening, but if they can sort of tolerate what they feel as threat and realize, but wait, I'm still in relationship with this person. This guy, Jeff, doesn't have the same reaction to me. It doesn't have the same point of view or opinion as me. And this is scary, but oh my gosh, we're still in relationship. We're still talking. He still seems to care about me. I still feel okay with him. This is kind of different kind of relationship we're having here. So I think that is can be profoundly helpful. But the pull is to just go on the same road of thinking and feeling that the patient is on. There's kind of this kind of in the air sense that I need you to think and feel the way I am, and don't have a different point of view because that is too scary. And it's like, let's look at that. How scary that is. See if you can actually tolerate better than you think you can.
Like, it's also all about the limited reparenting, like that someone can experience, that, as you said, that I can be separated, I can be like myself. Jeff is also a different person, but we can be in the healthy relationship, with boundaries, with everything. And I'm still accepted. I'm still in this relationship. So I heard that this is very important here.
Very important, and that in the early stages, in particular, that I can tolerate the tension of the fact that we're two different people having two different reactions. Like that, tension, what really feels like on a 1 to 10 level of scariness, like over time, actually feels just mildly tense, and something that I can kind of sit with fairly comfortably, not entirely comfortably, but fairly comfortably. That kind of experience, I think, is really, really vital for someone with enmeshment and undeveloped self, is that we have differences. I think it's super scary at times. It seems unbelievably scary, but now it doesn't. It just feels like maybe a little tense. And then sometimes there's this like, oh my gosh, I can sort of enjoy these differences. Like, look at how different he feels and he thinks. And here we are. That was not something that a lot of people experienced in their family of origin, or what they thought they could experience in their life outside of the family origin up to the time they came to therapy.
Yeah. Do you also use maybe some special types of imaginary work or mode work, like especially for example, the enmeshment and undeveloped self schema?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the 4 modes I often work with, whether it be some form of chair work or imagery work, are what I call the enmeshed vulnerable child, the angry child, the enmeshed demanding parent, and the healthy adult. Because I think it's sort of this dynamic, this internalized dynamic between the enmeshed vulnerable child who thinks, I've got to take care of this parent.
Yeah.
And the enmeshed demanding parent who says, yes, you must. In fact, that's kind of going on, that they're like kind of joined, that those two modes are joined at the hip to perpetuate the schema. And I like to think of the angry child, whether I do it in chair work or in imagery work, to sort of break this bond, to sort of create a rift between the enmeshed child and the enmeshed demanding parent, and to kind of educate the enmeshed vulnerable child that this is not okay. This is trapping you. This is making you feel like you're not free in your life and you're not free in your relationships. And this is what makes me mad. I have a need for autonomy, and this enmeshed demanding parent, enmeshed vulnerable child is keeping me locked. So in imagery, I like to kind of cultivate the angry child to kind of break this up and provide some emotional education to the vulnerable child, and to sort of, push the demanding enmeshed parent away. And then to sort of make space, again, this can be done in chair work, and I've done it in imagery as well, to then introduce a replacement for the enmeshed demanding parent, and that is the healthy adult, to sort of say, hey, listen, I want you to be autonomous. I want you to, cultivate the unique person that you are and to discover who that is. And I want to support that. And sometimes you may need others, because we all do, and sometimes others may need you. And attending to another's needs and your needs being attended to is essential for building bonds. But you also have the right to choose whether you'll, attend to certain needs or not, right? Because the way it is now, that it's like it's an obligation. There's like, it's what I have to do. There's no choice in the matter. What I'm trying to cultivate with the combination of the angry child and with the healthy adult is there is more choice there than you realize. And it's a function of the enmeshment schema that says you don't. You just have to show up in the way you have to show up. So those modes are very much in my head, and I'll work with them in chair work, and I'll work with them in imagery, and I'll use, memories from their past to sort of, cultivate those modes and sort of kind of push them in those kind of directions in order to create that new dynamic, that new internal dynamic. But I use their actual memories and from the past or their current situations in their life, the current relationships.
Imaginary rescripting,
exactly.
Changing those with the new mode.
With more heightened, use of the healthy adult and a more heightened use of the angry child.
Yeah.
Because anger is not a particularly, in fact, I would say it's not a particularly good emotion for cultivating relationships, because it's not. It often pushes people away or people shut down, but it's a very important emotion in terms of understanding what you need. And if we can listen to our angry part or the anger that we feel and explore it, we get more data on what we actually need. And that can sort of inform how we communicate to another person if we're feeling angry at that person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, we can set the boundaries being angry at someone. Yeah, it helps.
Yeah. Right. It helps remind us. Anger is often a reaction to a boundary violation. You're pushing too far, you're imposing too much, you're trying to control me that way. And so I'm having this angry reaction. But what I think is important is, can you explore and understand the angry reaction to what actually it turns out to be a boundary violation, and then communicate it to the other person without the anger or without as much anger, right? Yeah. Because I think that's a better way to actually get your point across. Because when we lead with anger, all people often hear is the anger, and it usually does not allow them to actually hear the need, which is what you really want to get made clear to the other person. And expressing the anger really often perpetuates the enmeshment, because then you feel guilty about the anger, and they're mad at you because you're angry at them, and now you owe them that, and it's just like it kind of tangles you even more. Yeah, you're all clenched up all over again. That thing which you thought was going to activate more of a separation and ends up getting you more tangled up. But if you use anger to sort of, exactly. But if you can use the anger to sort of understand and then inform your healthy adult, then, needs can be expressed and boundaries can be set, that are more healthy and more comfortable for you.
Are there any schemas that are maybe similar to enmeshment and undeveloped self-schema? Yeah. And what are the similarities and how you can tell the difference, for example, like the most similar?
Yeah. Well, I have a bias that I don't know is widely accepted in the schema therapy world, that the two schemas that are most similar to enmeshment are often the overlayer schema to enmeshment. And those are subjugation and self-sacrifice, where I must do for you if it's self-sacrifice, or else I feel guilty, like I'm a bad person. So my focus is on you so as not to feel guilt. Basically, it's kind of self-sacrifice in a nutshell. And subjugation is I must do for you because I fear the consequences. I fear some sort of punishment or some sort of loss if I'm not that way. So they're both very other focused as opposed to other and self-focus or a good amount of self-focus. Now, those two schemas are, conditional schemas. There's two categories. There's the, 12 unconditional schemas that we think to be more core to one's being.
Yeah.
Enmeshment's one of those. And then there are these about, I think, 5 or 6 conditional schemas that are schemas that develop a little later in life as a way to sort of solve the earlier core schema.
Yes.
Self-sacrifice, subjugation are conditional schemas. We generally think that they develop a little later, and they're the overlay of a deeper schema. It doesn't always have to be enmeshment, but sometimes it is enmeshment. And so those can look more similar to enmeshment because actually underneath it, it's the enmeshment that's actually fueling those two schemas in the first place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they definitely look the most similar. And I think very often they're most similar because they are basically the
coexist.
They coexist, exactly. But more in a more vertical way, enmeshment here, subjugation there, rather than
copy strategy. Yeah, like this obligation could be or self-sacrifice. Yeah, too.
Totally. I also want to say that any of the other conditional schemas can be an overlay to enmeshment. For instance, approval seeking. That's a conditional schema. That I think can be driven by enmeshment because I'm so insecure about who I am out here. I need extra doses of approval from out there, from you and others, in order to calm this anxiety about my own confusion. So that could be the case. Unrelenting standards can also be an overlay schema to enmeshment because my sense of self is about being great, doing things better than everything else. So I'm in this unrelenting standards loop in order to say, this is who I am, because deep down I don't really know who I am and I don't know how to even begin to figure out who I am. So those could be there too. And also I want to do one more thing that if you have the enmeshment schema, you probably have the emotional deprivation schema, which is probably the most common schema of them all, where it's you're being deprived, you're deprived of not sufficient nurturance and guidance and empathy, which is, not getting enough empathy is like an essential ingredient to developing the enmeshment schema. So those actually go hand in hand as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much, Jeff, for the interview. It was an honor and a big pleasure to have you on my podcast as a guest.
Well, thank you, Adam. It actually was a real joy to spend some time with you and talk about a very favorite subject of mine.
Yeah, very important and like a very large knowledge. So thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with me and with everyone now who would be listening to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed spending this time with you.
Okay, great.